The smell hit you before the city did. Travelers approaching Paris in the 1300s reported catching the stench from 3 miles out. 3 miles. Not a city, a biological weapon with a skyline. This is what it actually felt like to be alive in medieval Paris. Not the cathedrals, not the kings, the mud, the blood, and the rot underneath all of it. Medieval Paris had no sewage system. None. What you were walking through every single day was a combination of human waste, animal entrails, rotting food scraps, pig feces, dead rats, and whatever liquid had drained out of the nearest tannery. The streets were essentially open sewers, and Parisians treated them exactly like that. There was a law, actually passed, actually enforced, that said you had to shout "Gare l'eau" before throwing your chamber pot out the window, which means the warning and the cascade of human waste arrived at almost exactly the same time. The streets were so narrow, some barely 5 feet wide, that neighbors on opposite sides could shake hands from their windows, which sounds charming until you realize what those hands had been doing. Butchers threw offal directly into the street. Dyers dumped toxic chemicals. Blacksmiths' horses stood in the same mud you crossed to get to church. You weren't walking through a city, you were wading through it. But at least you could see what was in the streets. The water, you had no idea what you were drinking. The Seine ran through the heart of Paris, and Paris ran everything into the Seine. Slaughterhouse waste upstream, laundry runoff, the output of every tannery, dye house, and hospital, and downstream, drinking water, drawn from the same river by the same people every single morning. They knew the water tasted wrong, so they cut it with wine. Even children drank wine and water mixtures because the alcohol killed some of the bacteria. Not all, some. If you were poor and couldn't afford wine, you drank it straight. Your gut would wreck you within days of arriving if you weren't born there. Visitors called it Paris sickness. We'd call it dysentery. Public fountains, when they existed, were shared with horses and pigs and used as convenient places to dump things. The medieval concept of a watershed was zero. The thing that was supposed to keep you alive was actively trying to kill you, and most people had no idea. But the water wasn't the most efficient killer. That lived in your walls, your bed, your hair. Medieval Paris had a rat problem the way the ocean has a water problem. Every feature of the city was rat infrastructure. The grain stores, the butcher scraps, the open sewers, the thatched roofs. Rat populations may have matched or exceeded the human population. You shared your walls with them, your floor, your bed.
And rats carried fleas. When the Black Death hit Paris in 1348, the city lost between a third and half its population in under 2 years. Some neighborhoods closer to 70% dead. Let that land. You wake up, 7 out of 10 people on your street are gone. The symptoms were not subtle. First, the buboes, swollen lymph nodes the size of eggs, sometimes apples, under your armpits, in your groin, on your neck, black, hard, burning to the touch. Then fever so severe people described seeing demons. Then internal bleeding that turned the skin black from the inside. Then death in 3 to 7 days. Physicians blamed bad air. They blamed the alignment of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars. The actual answer, a bacterium called Yersinia pestis, delivered by flea bite, was entirely invisible to them. You were dying from something you couldn't see, for reasons you didn't understand, in a city that had no idea how to stop it. You get sick in medieval Paris, you go to the doctor. This is a mistake. The solution was almost always bloodletting. They opened a vein and drained you, sometimes up to a pint at a time, on the logic that removing excess blood would restore balance. If you came in sick and weak, you left sicker and weaker. Surgery was performed by barbers, not surgeons, barbers. The red and white striped pole outside your barber shop, that's a bloodletting reference. The red is blood, the white is the tourniquet. Other treatments included pigeon excrement applied to open wounds, mercury rubbed into skin, emerald powder for stomach ailments if you could afford it. The main hospital had multiple patients sharing a single bed, contagious fevers next to post-surgery recovery. The death rate was so high that receiving last rites was standard admission procedure. Going to the hospital was a reasonable way to arrive healthy and not leave at all. Most Parisians lived in timber-framed buildings stacked 4, 5, 6 stories high. Each floor expanded slightly outward. No regulations, no inspections, no engineers, just ambition and cheap timber. Animals on the ground floor, people above. Paris burned constantly. Not rare disasters, annual events. Everything was wood, everything was straw. Candles were the only light source, and firefighting technology was a bucket and a prayer. If your building went, your neighbors went too, then the whole block. You shared one room with your entire family, and frequently a pig. At night, the shutters closed, the smoke had nowhere to go, and the darkness was total. Not dim, total, black. You slept in that. When the sun went down, the city changed completely. There was no street lighting. Nightfall meant darkness so complete that navigating the streets was genuinely dangerous, not metaphorically, actually dangerous. Criminals, the truands, controlled entire neighborhoods after dark and took what they wanted from anyone moving around. But the gangs weren't the worst part.
In 1438, a pack of 14 wolves entered Paris through a breach in the city walls and killed 40 people before being driven back. Inside the city, in a capital of tens of thousands, wolves killed 40 people. If you had any reason to be outside at night, a birth, a death, an emergency, you went armed, in a group, with a torch. If the torch went out, you stopped moving and waited for dawn. The night watch was wildly understaffed. They were not your protection. You were on your own. So you stayed inside, with the smoke, with the pig, with the sounds outside your shuttered window. And you waited for morning. If you were a working-class Parisian, your diet was coarse bread, grain mush, salted fish, and cheap wine. No refrigeration meant meat rotted fast. Butchers sold whatever they had before it fully turned. Heavy spices, pepper, cloves, cinnamon, weren't used because food tasted good. They were used to mask the smell of meat that had started to go. If a medieval recipe calls for aggressive spicing, you know what that means. When the harvests failed, and they did regularly, catastrophically, the bread ran out. Paris saw famines in 1315, 1322, 1418. Each time, bodies appeared in the streets, not plague bodies, starvation bodies, in the capital city of France. A bad harvest tripled bread prices. For people spending 80% of their income on food, that was a death sentence with a 2-month fuse. This is the city people romanticize. This is where people set their love stories. Swap the violin music for the sound of starving children, and you have the full picture. When the Black Death arrived, the church said it was God's punishment. The correct response was more prayer, more penance. Flagellants appeared in the streets, men whipping themselves with leather straps embedded with metal spikes, traveling between cities to demonstrate their suffering to God. This did not stop the plague, it spread it faster. Executions happened in public squares. Stocks and pillories were permanent street furniture. You walked past them every day with your children. Justice in medieval Paris was swift, brutal, and essentially arbitrary. Life expectancy in medieval Paris, approximately 35 years. That number is dragged down by infant mortality so catastrophic that 1 in 3 children didn't make it to age 5, in many neighborhoods. If you survived childhood and made it to 25, your odds improved. You might see 50. But getting there meant surviving a filter so severe that old age belonged to the extraordinarily lucky, the extraordinarily strong, or the wealthy. Because everything we've discussed hit the poor almost exclusively. The wealthy could leave during plague years.
They had wine instead of river water. They died too, less often, of different things. The Paris of romantic imagination existed for maybe 5% of its population. The other 95% were living what we just described. You would not have survived it. Statistically, most of you watching this would not have made it to 30. Be glad for the boring miracle of treated water and germ theory and buildings that don't lean over a river of sewage. Medieval Paris was extraordinary. It was also, for most people who lived there, genuinely worse than you can imagine. If this broke you a little, wait until you see what daily life looked like in medieval London, or Tokyo, or Constantinople. Different city, same story. History is brutal, and almost nobody tells you the real version. Subscribe so you don't miss it.